When we zoom in or when we zoom out, things start to essentially change, not just a little bit. Things start to get upside down. When we zoom out, there's some kind of generalization happening, rounding up or rounding down. And when we zoom in, things start to get a little bit more precise. And then we need to ask ourselves the question, is it the one or is it the other? And once we start to zoom, we see that it's both. So how can we reconcile that both seem to be true at the very same time? Well, I would say that there is no absolute right answer. It's always yes and it's always no at the same time. It's both and it's neither. The reason for that is that there's something I call multilayered truths. Everything is true or false and it's relative, so it depends on the level of magnification. Also, when people ask me a certain thing and like what is the one main reason, or usually they just ask for the reason, in my point of view there are always more than one reasons. And the one we pick, it's a rather arbitrary choice. Of course, from our human perspective, from a way of perceiving things, there seems to be just one possibility. Still, if I look closely, is it A or is it B or is it C? It's usually everything at the same time, and therefore I conclude it's nothing. Also the other way around, when something is nothing, it has potential to be everything. It has to be that way, because otherwise it would be a contradiction, otherwise it would be nonsense. So logically it must be, this can be the only solution. And therefore we have this reconciliation, we have harmony at last. Take for example the question of, do I exist? I would say, well, it depends, yes and no, both at the same time, neither. Is the I, the self, a thing, an entity on its own? Also the question, where do we come from and where do we go to? Well, for me it seems obvious, because when I die I go back to the place where I was before I was born. So again, the answer is yes and no at the same time. And this is kind of nice, because then spirituality and science finally meet each other. They're both right in a relative sense, and none is right in a more absolute sense. When we zoom out, for example, we are entities in a big organism, embedded, interconnected. When we zoom in, we are not really there, we are just dead chemical processes, protein robots, we're not really alive. Let alone from the physical point of view, which I will illustrate later when we come to the illusion of separation. We are human beings who have a body, and it consists of organ systems and trillions of cells, consisting of trillions of molecules, trillions of atoms. So the you entity, that conscious being, it consists of cells, and a cell is an entity on its own, at least it used to be one. And the same thing happens when we look at ants or bees, this hive, this collective being. There's a higher being constructed out of a smaller being, which is called emergence. You can see there's some kind of synergy where 1 + 1 = 3, which I will also talk about in a moment. So from a human perception, I would say yes, I agree, there is a me, there's a book, there's a cup, there's a spoon, there are separate things. Otherwise I would call a person insane, and please go see a doctor. At the same time, I also have to say, well, these things don't exist. See again, illusion of separation, because they're just mental constructs. It's like a word. A word is an abstraction of reality, but not reality itself. Looking at religion, looking at spirituality, or even philosophy, they're all saying the same, and therefore I have this very confident feeling to answer that question with, we all agree on the same, I don't exist. So I had this final revelation of this moment of figuring out, yes, now there it is, the answer, I don't exist. Then I would think again, how to really unite that with the idea that there's an I which observes this answer, the illusion of I. Well, consciousness, rather tricky thing. So for me, these answers we give, they're just simplifications. It's just a very quick answer, a decision response we give, deciding whether something is yes or no, true or false, good or bad. But once we zoom in, when we look more closely, It's not that easy anymore. The clear yes and no starts to disappear because everything gets a little bit more fuzzy, more unclear and uncertain. The separating line gets more blurry. And we have to answer with, it depends. We have to see things more nuanced, more differentiated, and regard more the context, and therefore everything becomes more relative. As a proper philosopher, we would also need to see things more deeply, and then we see there is no simple answer, no simple yes or no. We also don't have a firm opinion anymore because everything is relative and everything is uncertain. So yeah, at the edges we see no clear distinctions anymore. Looking at space, if we go beyond, what happens if we go further? We zoom out in space. What's there at the end of the universe, considering it's finite? Is there war, and what's behind that? Me, with a human brain, I cannot even imagine what an infinite universe would look like. But if we zoom in into space, well, there are objects, right? They are composed of molecules and atoms of a certain element. There's a core with protons and neutrons and an electron cloud around it. There are these particles, a very reductionistic way of looking at things, trying to understand the bigger thing by dissecting the smaller parts and understand them, divide and conquer approach. But at the bottom, as far as we know today, there are these fundamental particles, quarks, and they're not made out of anything else. Sure, that's the end. Because otherwise it would be an infinite question of like what it is it made out of. And we would never stop asking that question. So there must be some wall, but for me a wall is strange. Anyways, if you look at different materials like wood, metal, plastic, wool, whatever, they seem to be different, but when we zoom in, we see that they're only molecules and they're again composed of atoms. So atoms, they are all made out of the same substance. The difference disappears when we zoom in deep enough. Wood, metal, plastic, wool, they're all made out of like protons, neutrons and electrons. And there's no difference in them, but just in configuration and amount, maybe. Things get upside down, for example, that the physical laws are changing. There's this little creature called a fairy fly, and it's so tiny that what is air, gas state for us, it's liquid to that little creature, and it can swim through it. At that point, I would like to recommend these very fascinating interactive animations when we zoom in and zoom out, showing the sizes of different things, from the smallest string from string theory to the most huge nebula there is in our universe. It's scaleofuniverse.com. Have a look, it's fun. If we look at the universe and we zoom in, there is a possibility that there's some kind of infinite loop. If we zoom deeper and deeper, we start on top again. So we're kind of going in circles. It's this game based on Alan Watts' approach called Everything, where you can interactively experience that infinite loop. There's a word within the word, and they all occupy the same space. Yet they're independent and also invisible to each other. At the same time, they're also not interfering, they're not in conflict with each other, they have no impact on each other. Which is kind of what they showed also in the Ant-Man movie, Quantum Space, but then like we still go in circles. So it is kind of known what's below quarks, but for me the question is what is above? Some kind of superorganism? Well, we can't see, we can't know yet. And talking about the illusion of separation, from a human level of perception, yes, there seem to be separate things, but when you zoom in or out enough, we see that boundaries start to get a little bit more blurry. We zoom in on the subatomic level, that there is no boundary, and also the same happens with words, definition, concepts, in the conceptual realm. There seem to be different objects, but once we zoom in deep enough, they start to disappear, because we can't properly determine its clear boundary, the line anymore. These boundaries start to disappear, and it's impossible to tell exactly the line where it runs. Everything therefore becomes kind of one. We zoom in far enough into the skin, for example, we will have difficulty saying where it clearly begins and where it ends. It's more like a gradient and everything becomes like one big blob. Yet, as I said, in our human perception there are clearly distinct objects, but at the same time they are not. So again, it all depends on the level of magnification. What about time? If we go beyond, what happens if we go further in time? What happened? What was there before the beginning of the universe, before the beginning of time? And what is there after the end of the universe, after the end of time? I mean, we could also ask, who created God? So what was before the universe? And who created them and who created them? And again, we are getting stuck in this infinite loop. Maybe something easy. What happens if we change speed? Like turning the knob of speed and making it a little bit more fast forward or slow down in a stop motion kind of thing. We would see different things, different patterns would become visible which were not existing, or at least invisible before. Because the perception of us humans, but also any kind of creature, of time is different, it's relative. For flies it might be fast, for elephants it might be slower. We zoom out. If we would look at plants, they kind of resemble animals. They move like us. They move towards light and they even have this wake-sleep rhythm. So doing a fast forward and observe plants, animals, they look like animals. They're moving, they're reactive. And it must be similar, I guess, for insects, because they perceive everything so differently, so much faster. I can imagine to them we look like statues. We are very like made out of rock and not barely moving, at least. Fun fact there is that if we zoom in far enough, we would actually see that we constantly live in the past. Light or even sound needs some time to travel. Everything we see, hear and sense is happening in the past. I mean, we can look into the depth of the universe, seeing its past or its creation billions of years ago. Even if we just look at the sun, which is not that far considering like cosmic sizes. What we see is 8 minutes ago. Light travels with 300 million meters per second, so it's kind of fast, but still over these distances it's still the past. Sound is of course much slower with 300 meters per second, but still it needs some time to travel. Even you right now watching this video and hearing my voice, the photons emitted by the screen take some time to reach your retina. Even touch itself, it needs some time to travel through the nerves, up to the central nervous system into the brain, and then be processed there. Everything we experience happened already. It's just so small for our human perception that it's not big of a deal, and it seems all happening at the same time, what I hear, what I see, what I touch, but actually there's quite some delay in there if you zoom in enough. It somehow works good enough. Fun fact is that you can reduce all our 5 main senses to touch. Like when we smell something, some molecules touch our inside of our nose. Seeing is photons bombarding our retina, and well, taste and touch is obviously some kind of touch happening there. And also movement of the body, we say pushing and pulling, rotating and doing all kind of strange complex movement, but in the end it can all be reduced to just contraction and the absence of contraction. Entering a little bit more an abstract realm, I was mentioning emergence before. Some people would identify themselves with a country. There are things like companies we work for, but I would ask myself, does it even exist if we zoom in? Because there is nothing, there is no essence anymore. Societies, they don't really exist. What about the beehives and the ant collectives? I mean, is the hive existing because it's just composed of several separate entities? And from a reductionistic point of view, I would say no, we take things apart and there's nothing left anymore. As I said, there's no essence. But the pattern emerges only on higher levels. I mean, that's fascinating, right? A wave, whether it's a sound wave or electromagnetic wave, which is kind of light, is not an entity but a pattern. If we zoom in we see, no, there is no such thing. They're just, for a regular water wave, for example, separate molecules. There is no such thing as a wave. But of course, in our human level of perception, yes, there is. It's a useful abstraction. It's necessary to be able to communicate and navigate in our reality. Very popular examples of emergent properties is water isn't wet. There is no such thing as wetness down there. Heat is also just the way we perceive things, like color is. It's not existing. Heat is just movement, right? It's kinetic energy. It's like little parts wiggling, moving, vibrating and rotating around in space like crazy. And the more they move, the more heat we experience. But down there, heat doesn't exist. What about consciousness? Whew, again, it itself seems to be more an emergent property because we have never found a soul somewhere in our heart, belly, brain, wherever. So if we start to zoom out, we see that a bunch of cells create something we call a human being. So let's just assume a bunch of humans would therefore construct something we can call a country. But what if we see the whole planet as a bunch of countries or humans, all as one entity, the planet as a single organism? But what about seeing a bunch of stars or galaxies? They compose something we call universe. Could that not also be some kind of entity on its own, on a higher level of magnification? An entity which emerges. The universe is an organism, not an orgasm. It's like the complexity of the brain. Because it's so extremely complex, an emergent property arises which we call consciousness. And like the universe has trillions of stars, our brain has trillions of synapses. So why would it be any different? Another fascinating abstract phenomenon is reoccurring patterns, that we see the same universality in all levels. So take a tree, for example. A tree is a manifestation of the universe. You study the tree, you study the universe, because all its principles are represented in the tree. If we zoom in, if we zoom out, we always see the same. The tree and the parts of the tree, the branches and the roots. Even leaves themselves, just fucking look at broccoli or lightning, rivers, lungs, blood vessels, our circulatory system, even cracks in walls. Always the same pattern is showing. There are these Mandelbrot fractal patterns, which also shows this branching very nicely. It's a recursion, which basically has to do with maximizing the surface on limited space, self-similarity. But also in Chinese philosophy, they would say that the macrocosm equals the microcosm, that by studying the small, we really understand the big. They applied in their medical system that we understand the single human, we understand the whole universe. Same they do, like you look at the foot and you can see the whole representation of the body. What about harmony? Or chaos, peace and war? What seems to be one is the other on another level. And look at my arm right now. You can see skin, and it seems pretty much at peace right now. Right? There's not even movement happening. So, see, when I zoom in, I see that some kind of bacteria try to invade my body, and the immune system killing it. There are some acids and total destruction, annihilation. That's really warfare going on there. But if I zoom in again a little bit more into cells, in the molecules, in the atoms, see, everything is in harmony again, right? There's peace, like electrons are doing their dance, atoms bonding with each other. Oh, it's beautiful. Then again, if we zoom in a little bit more, we see that electromagnetic waves kind of push out electrons out of the shell, and massive radiation might destroy some atomic structure of our tissue. Going the other direction, if I zoom out, the village seems to be very much at peace I live in. But then again, countries, they might be at war with each other. If we zoom out a little bit further, we see the whole planet in peace, orbiting the sun, doing its own dance. This little blue wonderful rock We zoom out, you might see the solar system pushing and pulling by this gigantic black hole and galaxies smashing into each other. And then again, the whole universe being at peace in itself again. And who knows what's even further. We could play the same game in temporal magnifications. The same happening there. What seems to be chaos in a single day might be total harmony on the grander scale of time. It's part of a balance game. So all what is good. The evil, destruction, the chaos, it's all part of the game, I would say. To round up, sometimes I'm seeing difficulties, problems which seem to be not solvable, and then I would reconsider my basic assumption. The basic assumption is linear thinking. As we said with space, what happens if we go further? What is behind the wall of the universe and what's behind there? Time the same. What was there before the beginning, before birth, and what's after the end? What is after death? The solution seems to be a circular way of thinking. Time, as well as space-time, it's an infinite loop. It is without beginning and ending. Who created God? Well, it's a web without a weaver. Once we go beyond the quantum realm, we end up again with the whole universe again, because we go in a loop. Everything was always there and it was never created. We never die because we never came alive in the first place. We just always were. Puny little human brain can't comprehend that, right? Like trying to teach a donkey algebra. Won't work, just the hardware is not good enough. Still, it seems to make more sense to me that everything is a recursion, everything is within itself, and maybe I'm indeed just a donkey, and I'm just not able to understand it with the given hardware, with my given brain. But why am I actually talking about that all? I think it's something more personal, that my mother was left-wing, my father was right-wing, and now me trying to find harmony between these two complementary forces, the feminine, the spiritual, the emotional, the organic, the masculine, the scientific, the rational, the analytical. These are two ways of approaching life, of looking at things, and I needed to bring them together somehow, my mother and my father. So the solution for the dilemma for me was to just somehow find a way that both can be true at the same time, to finally re-establish harmony. So the actual question is not whether it's true or not. The question is, from which level are we looking at it? Within a given context, within a specific level of magnification, I can then say whether it is relatively true or false. At the same time, I always have to answer both are correct and both are wrong.